सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
We have for you an interesting takeaway from Moscow. And this is from something that S. Jaishankar, our External Affairs Minister, who's been traveling there on a short visit, he's been talking. So among the things he said, he was trying to make the point that India-Russia relationship is not what it used to be, not in terms of better or worse, but he was just underlining the changing nature of the relationship and also the equation. So he did mention in one of the discussions there, and that is something, that is an utterance, or that's a statement that got some headlines, also got social media buzz. It was a factual point that he made. He said that, look, this is a different relationship. In 1991, when this Russia came into being, that means when Soviet Union finally broke up, these were the cataclysmic events of 1989 and 1990 that finally led to the breakup of the Soviet Union and the creation of several successor states, of which the main successor state was the Russian Federation, or the Russia as we see today. For much of that period, this happened in 1991. From 99 until now, Vladimir Putin has been in charge. Likely that he'll also be in charge for the next many years. That said, this Russia is Putin's Russia. So he said that Russia in 1991 had a GDP of $518 billion, 518 billion dollars. What was India's GDP in 1991? It's an important year for India as well, because remember, that's when India started its economic reform. That's when Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh took over, and that's when the big changes in India's economy took place. In 1991, the same time, because India also, economic reform came also as a response to the end of the Cold War and the dismantling of the Soviet Empire and the Soviet bloc, or the Warsaw Pact, or whatever you call it. In 1991, therefore, that is a good landmark, good testing point. Russia GDP is $518 billion. India is $270 billion. 270 billion dollars. That's almost a half of Russia's in 1991. So in terms of total GDP, India was almost a half of Russia in 1991, or you can say Russia was twice as big as India's GDP in 1991, despite whatever had happened in the Soviet Union, the breakup and the crisis before that. It was still an economy twice as big as India's. What has happened now? So don't come up to 2023, because data doesn't come to us so easily, but or so quickly, but we can imagine what it would be like now. But if you just look at 2022, and that is the point that Jaishankar also took. So 1991, 518 and 270, or if you want to look at it from the Indian point of view, 270 to 518. Whereas in 2022, this equation reversed. 2022, India was $3.42 trillion, the size of the economy, and Russia had now become $2.24 trillion. So that makes India in 2022 already about a little more than 1.5 times bigger than Russia. This is the Indian economy, which was half the size of Russia 31 years back in this case. Now, if you extrapolate this to 2023, we know what India's growth rate has been. We also know what Russia's growth rate has been. We don't know the exact figures because it's a moving target. It changes all the time. We can safely say that this gap has further increased. So if India's economy at this point is about $3.65, $3.7 trillion or thereabouts, Russia's would be just about 2.3. So this gap has increased, and this gap is increasing. That's a very striking point. I'm quite sure that Jaishankar's point was not to show down Russia, because he had gone to Russia to assert India's continuing friendship with Russia. Everything he said in Russia was that this is an old friendship. We have partnership with Russia in technology, in high-tech military equipment, in space, in science, things like that, and those things those things do not happen with ordinary friends. So it's a special friendship, it's an old friendship. So his idea was not to show down Russia. The point he was trying to make was that India has changed greatly in the course of time, and that is an accurate point. Now that said, something else happened. Something else happened in the sense that something else came to our notice, my notice in this case. That is a tweet by Tanvi Madan. Tanvi Madan is one of the most respected Indian strategic scholars, most respected internationally. She's based in Washington. She's a senior fellow at Brookings Institution. Now, Tanvi Madan tweeted, and please see her tweet. Tanvi Madan tweeted, and she drew a very good conclusion. She said, see, Russia was actually doing quite well. Russian economy was bigger than India's. It was continuing to be bigger than India's, and then something happened dramatically that Russia's economic momentum broke. India's economic growth picked up, as it had picked up from 1991 onwards, and then this gap was built up, and this gap has now not only remained built, but it's also increasing now. Now, what happened that broke Russia's economy? We will talk about that for a couple of minutes, and through that also go into a little bit of discussion about a political term called Irredentism, which I will explain to you. And because we will talk about its politics, its history, its consequences, particularly in contemporary times, at least in the decades that we have lived through, that you will also see a fair bit of heavy analysis, some drawing of conclusions, and maybe some opinion or something that might sound like opinion to you. I will try and still keep it within analysis, but there will be a drawing of conclusions, because we are talking about a political concept, a political theory, and how it works out in real life, because that is what is behind irredentism, is what is behind Russia's decline. India's economy is growing. India would probably have narrowed the gap by now, because when you have an economy growing from a low base, you can have a higher growth rate. So Russia, on the other hand, you had some years of good growth, some years of bad growth, 1 year of really negative growth, 2009, I think that was the year of the global financial crisis, but generally was growing, but India was slowly picking up. But the big change came because of that one fact, irredentism. Now, where do I find that fact? If you look at this map on your screens, it's also the map that Tanvi Madan used with her tweet. This map tells you, just see where is it that the two graphs cut each other. So you can see there is a point in 2010, and until about 2010, Russia and India are running about parallel. 2009 is the global financial crisis, and you can see that Russia has fallen at that point, and that is the reason it has come close to India. Otherwise, it was running ahead of India. Then it carries on like that. 2011, 2012, 2013, it is once again way ahead of India. You can see that. You can see that. You can see that. You can see another mini peak there. Then suddenly it falls. It falls in 2014. It falls quite steeply, and then continues to struggle somewhere there until 2022. There is some growth in 2021, but everybody got some growth in 2021. That was post the decline of 2020, the first year of the pandemic. Every economy in the world declined at that point. So they might have had some growth in 2021, and I will give you some figures. But generally, 2014 is when the Russian economy lost its momentum. India, of course, continued on growing. The fact, however, is that India's growth 2014 onwards has not been the highest in its post-reform history. In the previous 10 years, its average growth was higher than in these 9 years since 2014. But even the average of about 5.5% in these 9 years, which includes 1 year of negative growth, and that is 2020. So it all gets averaged out, but it also has another year of very bad growth. That is 2019. Pre-pandemic, that was 3.87%. Even with that average, even with that average of 5.5 or thereabouts over these 9 years, see how India's GDP graph has gone up. Russia has continued to struggle. So what is it that happened in 2014 that Russia's economy lost its way? That is called irredentism. What is irredentism? Irredentism is a political theory or political idea or political ideology which is defined as desire by one state or one country to annex a territory in another state. That can come from many motivations, and we'll talk about that. In this case, we know what we are talking about. 2014 is when Russia annexed Crimea, because Russia had the view that historically Crimea is our territory. It has become wrongly, unfairly a part of Ukraine. So they went ahead and they annexed Crimea. That is not an annexation that most countries in the world have accepted. India also has not accepted this. India has abstained at the UN at many votes, but India has also not accepted it. So Crimea is what they annexed in 2014, and that is what drew sanctions. And those massive sanctions then began to damage Russia's economy. That damage to Russia's economy, and then you can now see that Russia also began at some point, preparing for the war that's now been going on. So this is the price Russia has paid for this nostalgia for reuniting with itself territories that it thought were its own. That is classical irredentism. So irredentism, desire by one state to annex a territory of another state, it can come from an ethnic impulse. See, Hitler in Europe, the whole idea of uniting all German-speaking or ethnically German territories. That is how he annexed Sudetenland, and he did much more after that. So that's the most visible example and the most striking example in the last 100 years or so. Or the motivation can be historical, again, as we have seen now with Russia and Crimea, although a little bit of the ethnic element is also there, because Russians say the population in that part of what used to be Ukraine is more Russian-speaking than Ukrainian-speaking. That's also their claim on Donbass, and that's why that also is a move in irredentism. Again, it can be religious. For religious motivation, go no further than Pakistan and Kashmir. They think that Kashmir is a part of their country, should become a part of their country, and if it can't become a part of their country peacefully, they will use military means to annex it, as they tried in 1947-48 the first time, 1965 the second time. Having failed in both the attempts and seeing themselves militarily weaker than India, they've been trying to take it by using terrorism as an instrument of state policy since, I would say, at some point in 1980s. I do believe that this started in Punjab in 1981-82 in Indian Punjab, when the Pakistanis were emboldened by their initial successes in Afghanistan, where they were fighting the Soviets in partnership with Americans, Chinese, Saudis and others, and they thought, look, if this is working against the mighty Soviet forces, something like this could work in India as well. As we have explained to you in earlier episodes, and also I think I wrote about in National Interest, it was the same hankering for Kashmir by hook or by crook that destroyed Pakistan's economy. And I have mentioned it in the past to you that in 1985, when I first went to Pakistan, Pakistan's average per capita GDP was 65% higher than India's. Today it's 40% or more lower, and the gap is increasing. I see that as Pakistan taking resort to terrorism to get Kashmir, to annex Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir from 1981-82 onwards, and this then really peaked by 1989, and in the process, the momentum of Pakistan's economy broke as well, and it went into a tailspin. So once again, evidence, if evidence is needed, that irredentism, this kind of nostalgia is nonsensical and does not do well for any country. From where does the expression irredentism come from? It comes from Italian history. So the original expression from which irredentism is drawn was Italia irredenta, which means unredeemed Italy. So in the mid-19th century, actually especially after 1878, a movement grew in Italy claiming many parts of Europe as its original territories. This included Switzerland, if you believe it. This included large parts of Switzerland, large parts of Switzerland Italian is spoken. This included large parts of Switzerland and what used to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire. More recently, we've seen Somalians invade Ethiopia. Also, Argentinians going to Falklands, or what they called Malvinas, saying that these are our islands, this used to be our territory. In that case, again, motivation was both ethnic as well as historic, and the idea of a greater Serbia and now the idea of a greater Russia. In fact, even now, Putin and his followers insist that Ukraine actually is an illegitimate entity. In fact, in one of his early speeches after the war, one of his early angry speeches, Putin had said as much. He had said that these republics came into being because he didn't exactly use these words, but he implied that these were errors made by Lenin, that he allowed these republics to come up, and that's where he said Ukraine was never a state earlier. It's the same people, same language, same culture, etc., etc. How are they a separate country? That is once again classical irredentism, which means jo tera hai, wo bhi mera hai, because we are one country. Now, what history tells us is, the more recent history, you can see the Somalians, you can see the Argentinians, they lost that war so badly and suffered severely because of that. We have seen what happened in Serbia, and we are seeing what's happening to Russia's economy as a result of what's happened. One, because of the annexation of Crimea, that's where this downturn started. And now with 2 years of war in Ukraine. So once again, what is the lesson? The lesson from all this is, and the lesson of history is, that irredentism does not serve any country, any community, any nationality well. Nationalism, hyper-nationalism, political nationalism, it's one thing to be patriotic, right? And that is the old debate about patriotism and nationalism. But nationalism, which can easily cross into hyper-nationalism, and when you go to hyper-nationalism, then you say, but I used to be so great. I used to be so great. And everything that I owned when I used to be so great, or my country used to be so great, should belong to me now. In our neighborhood, the prime example of this is China, because Xi Jinping now wants to restore to China the territories it had in the Qing dynasty, right? That is how he demands that we hand over Arunachal Pradesh to him. He demands almost all of what is called as South China Sea. He thinks it's like their provincial pond, right? And many other parts and many other island territories here and there, and also has other territorial claims. All of this comes from history. That's also the same concept. So once again, this kind of nostalgia has not worked for anybody. That it doesn't work in modern times is shown even more starkly by the experience of Putin's Russia. You want to see evidence of that? See how that graph turns, how those lines intersect, and how the Russian line remains way below and India keeps going up. There is no rivalry or tension between the two countries. There is no competition between the two countries. So it's not as if either or. It's not an either or situation. In fact, and India doing well is good for Russia. Russia doing well economically is good for India. So this is not a comparison in that sense. This is just a set of facts with explanation of a theory, political theory, and also contemporary history. Contemporary history, and in fact, also going back about 100 years or so to tell us, to underline to us how this kind of nostalgia, how this kind of hankering for what we think might have been our territory in the past and going out to take it, how damaging and how harmful and how self-destructive can it be. So the various countries, when they do this, or various societies, they use their own expressions. Usually they use the word greater. So you can see greater Russia, greater Serbia, or greater whatever, greater this, undivided this, akhand that, etc., etc. But for any state to try and expand its territory by using military force is a self-destructive move.